Leading off tonight, release the tapes. When will Dick Cheney release his testimony in the infamous Scooter Libby case? When will we know how he defended his chief of staff's criminal behavior in the outing of a CIA operative, Valerie Wilson, that led to Cheney's top guy's conviction for perjury and obstruction of justice, and, according to the prosecutor, left a dark cloud over Cheney's own head? I asked that question because last night, Cheney and his chief of staff, both in tuxedos, received joint honors from a group of ideological allies. Cheney for being Cheney, and his chief of staff apparently for taking the rap, what the group called his service before self. That sounds about right. Apparently, Dick Cheney can't help himself. Last night, he accused President Obama of waffling on our troops in Afghanistan and declared that the White House, quote, must stop dithering while America's armed forces are in danger. But wouldn't it have been good if we thought a bit before sending U.S. troops into Iraq? Perhaps a moment or two of dithering could have saved tens of thousands of lives. All this avuncular after-the-battle advice from the man who saw our troops in Iraq get chewed up in a civil war. So what gives Cheney any credibility to criticize this president on war policy? Plus, Congressman Alan Grayson just won't quit. Now he's promoting his new website, namesofthedead.com, on the House floor. The site allows readers to post personal stories about deaths related to the lack of health care in this country. But it also links to his re-election website where people can make donations. So did Grayson cross the line? We'll have him here to talk about it tonight. Also, is the White House really keeping a Nixon-style enemies list, or are Republicans just trying to smear the president by making him look like their guy? The Hardball strategist will break that one down. Plus, a haircut for Wall Street. The Obama administration listened to the critics and finally cut the pay by 50% of executives whose companies take government money. And it turns out that Bob Dole and Bill Frist are opposed to freedom. Did you catch that? At least according to Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, her ideas on who belongs in and out of the party in the Hardball sideshow tonight. Let's start with Dick Cheney's latest attack on President Obama. Frank Gaffney is the president of the Center for Security Policy, where Cheney spoke last night and was honored along with his chief of staff, Scooter Libby. And Ron Reagan's with Air America Radio right now. Good morning, Frank. Good morning, Ron. Let's take a look at what Dick Cheney said last night. This, I think, is the main thrust. Let's listen.
Having announced his Afghanistan strategy in March, President Obama now seems afraid to make a decision and unable to provide his commander on the ground with the troops he needs to complete the mission. It's time for President Obama to make good on his promise. The White House must stop dithering while America's armed forces are in danger. Make no mistake, signals of indecision out of Washington hurt our allies and embolden our adversaries. Waffling while our troops on the ground face an emboldened enemy endangers them and hurts our cause.
Ron Reagan, what do you make of this indictment by the former vice president against the president's war policy? Tough words, dithering, waffling, basically endangering our troops by not making a command decision timely enough. What do you make of it?
Well, you know, I'll tell you, many people on both sides of the aisle have concerns about where to go next in Afghanistan. I'm very nervous, for instance, and a lot of people are, about whether there's a middle way here that we can see our way through in Afghanistan. And, of course, Dick Cheney has every right to express his opinion about anything he wants to. But I have to say, of all the people on the face of the earth who lack credibility on this issue, Dick Cheney would have to be at the top of the list. He has gotten virtually everything wrong in terms of American warfighting over the last 8 years, the 8 years that he was in office. Iraq, threat to the United States? No, it wasn't. Involved with 9/11? No, Saddam Hussein wasn't. Did they harbor WMD? No, they didn't. Could we ignore Afghanistan for years while we pursued this war in Iraq? No, apparently we couldn't afford to do that. Our own generals are now saying it's in a downward spiral. So Dick Cheney has zero credibility on this issue.
Let me go to Frank. First of all, I opened the show tonight by talking about this case before the courts now. A judge is about to rule, apparently, that the testimony, by much of it, by Dick Cheney in defending his chief of staff, both of whom, by the way, you honored last night. I want to ask you why you honored a guy who's a felon, a convicted perjurer and obstructor of justice, and Dick Cheney. You said that his chief of staff was responsible for service before self. You know, that strikes me as a guy who took the bullet for Cheney. Your thoughts? Why are you honoring a guy for protecting the boss in this regard?
We honored Scooter Libby as well as Dick Cheney and
Why?
a whole gaggle of guys who served their country with great distinction, and that is not perhaps one of the things that one would recognize him for, but I think the rest of his service deserved that kind of
But why would you
accommodation.
put black ties on, all dress up, and give awards to these people? I don't get it. The president wouldn't pardon him. George W. Bush didn't think he was innocent.
I can't justify
You think he
the
was?
president's decision.
You think he was?
I have my thoughts on it, and my general feeling is that he got a raw deal. Yeah.
That he was innocent?
I think that
innocent and he wasn't covering for the vice president.
We know who told.
No, I'm talking about obstruction of justice and perjury.
We know who told the press about this instance, and I don't think it was.
Okay, it just seems odd that these guys. It just seems odd you guys keep giving awards on the right to anybody you like.
I think it's odd, but
well, I mean, getting on black tie and bringing up a convicted felon and saying, "Here's another trophy."
In a lot of different ways.
Anyway, do you think? Let me ask you a question. Should we get the whole story in that case ever? What the vice president's role was? Would you like to see his testimony made public? The judge apparently is going to rule in that direction.
I personally am in favor of transparency.
Great. Okay.
Whether it's
Let me ask you about
the United States or the vice president.
The vice president won't leave town. There's a tradition that you leave town after you leave office, but he sticks around like Pearl Mesta. He's like holding salons and all. Why does he accuse this president of dithering when the president is clearly trying to make the right decision? What's wrong with deliberation? Wouldn't a little deliberation have been a good thing before we sent all those guys to their death in Iraq? Thinking a little bit before you act? Your thoughts?
I think that that's a mischaracterization of what happened in Iraq, and I think it's a mischaracterization of what's happening
What's dithering mean?
Dithering means that you are signaling 6 months after you adopted a strategy with much fanfare, you appointed a general to go implement that strategy. You said at the time and repeatedly you were going to resource it properly, that you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what the strategy is. You don't know what resources it requires, and you're not sure how soon you'll be able to get it done.
Suppose new intel came in.
In the meantime,
new intel that Karzai didn't win the election, he's not our leader.
Didn't have anything to do with the strategy. These guys made a strategy 6 months ago. But here's the point, Chris. What we're watching is an unraveling that is happening in no small measure because the guys on the ground there, our guys perhaps, but certainly the bad guys, and a lot of Afghans in between, are saying, we're not sure they're going to be here. Right. And people adjust accordingly, and that's not good for our interest if this is a war of necessity, as the president has said.
Ron, you get in here because I read the speech. I read the vice president's speech, and I thought it was a very strong case for the need for us to be in there and defend the Afghan people against the Taliban forces who are coming back. The problem with his argument, it never really explains how we can ever leave. It's basically putting cement into a tree that's falling down, into the hole in the tree, putting cement into a dying tree, and somehow saying, well, we can't be this cement, though. We can't stay there forever. Eventually, we're going to have to come out of that tree, and the tree is going to fall down. So I don't get this strategy of being the Afghan Defense Force, which is what he seems to be recommending here.
I don't get it either, and you might want to ask Dick Cheney and maybe Frank Can the next time he sees him why, if putting more troops into Afghanistan is so important, Dick Cheney refused to do so when he was in office, and George Bush, his nominal boss, refused to do so. If we need more forces in Afghanistan to protect the Afghan people, etc., and fight the Taliban, why was he so reluctant to do that in the first place? And why was he so reluctant to get the job done in Afghanistan in the first place, too? Why divert our attention to Iraq, a war that didn't need to be fought because Iraq posed no danger to the United States? Why do that and ignore Afghanistan? Again, the man has no credibility. And just one last point on Scooter Libby and Dick Cheney being honored last night by Frank's group. It's one thing to honor a convicted felon. It's another thing to honor an unindicted war criminal, and that is exactly what Dick Cheney is. He was as instrumental as anybody in the administration in pushing the torture policy that humiliated this nation in front of the world. So I guess you get a big prize for that, too.
Well, look, where do I begin? Iraq was a war of necessity. We were dealing with a terrorist sponsoring regime that had access to weapons of mass destruction. We can debate that endlessly if you like.
Now it's access. I thought they had weapons of mass destruction.
They did have weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, the ones that we gave them in the 80s?
Ron,
the one that we gave them in the 80s?
Let me interrupt just for a second. Retired General Paul Eden of the National Security Network today issued this response to Vice President Cheney's remarks last night. We've been talking about it. The record is clear. Dick Cheney and the Bush administration were incompetent war fighters. They ignored Afghanistan for 7 years with a crude approach to counterinsurgency warfare. warfare, best illustrated by 1, denying it, 2, ignoring it, 3, bombing it. While our intelligence agencies called the region the greatest threat to America, the Bush White House under-resourced our military efforts, shifted attention to Iraq, and failed to bring to justice the men